Now, here we see a tiny example of culture, because culture is defined as the sum of implicit and explicit values, beliefs, and worldviews. Or to say it more easy, culture is the way how we think, and as a consequence also, how we do things. If you have statements like, we believe that the customer's needs are having the highest priority, this is a statement that you can have. That is a worldview or a belief. Values like fairness, cooperation, those are values, and they are kind of the core essence of how you do things. Now, if we look at that, we see culture emerging by the way how we collaborate. And I want to tell you a quick story about how an entrepreneur used that very successfully. It was a German entrepreneur who was sitting in his office somewhere in the area of Bielefeld. He was one of the old family business owners, a little bit greedy. He didn't want to spend a lot of money. And one day he was really annoyed because he found out that a few of his hired leaders were flying first class to the US. He, seeing that they were spending kind of the sum that a new car would cost on a flight to US and back, that was annoying him. He wouldn't be the one who ever wanted to do that. Now, what would have been the options to stop that? And in many organizations, we see then the need of the direct reaction. We see leaders making a guideline for traveling expenses, sending an email around, criticizing that behavior. Not so this entrepreneur. He did something completely different. He went to his secretary and said, Mrs. Meyer, the next time that the colleagues book a flight to the US, please also book a seat for me on the same plane. And Mrs. Müller asked, like always? And he said, yes, like always, please. It took a few weeks. And the flight was due. Our CEO and family business owner was already at the airport. He was sitting on a bench directly opposing the entrance of the first class lounge. When the two colleagues who booked the first class flight got out of the lounge, he approached them and said, hey, so nice that you are here as well. I wasn't aware that you were flying to the US. How awesome, we can spend an evening there together. That sounds brilliant. And they were having a really nice chat. Some small talk, how was the weekend, and all the things that you discuss. Until the point where they went onto the boarding bridge. And the two CEOs who were hired took the turn left in the direction of the first class. And the CEO went, nice seats you have. See you later when we land, going off into economy. Now, what do you think? How does someone feel as a hired CEO if that happens? What is going on in their brains now? Interestingly enough, it didn't take long that something very interesting happened. And that tells us a lot about how cultures form. Do you have an idea what happened? Well, it took about a day. And the story of the CEO and family business owner doing that with the other colleagues went like a bushfire through the whole organization. Everybody was talking about this embarrassing moment where the hired CEOs thought they would be something better and more valuable than the owner of the family business. This had a sustainable impact on the culture of that organization. Because what we have here is a strong experience of a value statement, right? If culture is the sum of implicit and explicit values, beliefs and worldviews, well, the entrepreneur made a clear, experienceable statement of what he sees as the right values. And he didn't do that by finger pointing. He didn't do that by making a traveling expense guideline and sending it via email. What he did is, he showed by a clear example. And that led to something very interesting. It led to a scenario where people knew what the values were that the business owner wanted to transport. But they weren't a fixed rule, so people would still be flexible to find their way around. A cost and traveling expense guideline would have probably said no business class flights. Well, in that organization a few years later, actually, there were first class flights happening, at least at one example. It was a salesman booking it. Now you might wonder, why the hell is a salesman booking a first class flight if the owner wouldn't do that? Well, it turns out the answer came very soon. It was that the salesman was working on a huge account and he wouldn't find a date to discuss it with the CEO of the other corporation. And he talked him into discussing it on the plane. And he wanted to sit next to the client and thus booked a flight also in the first class. And that is something that the entrepreneur heard. And he right away called that person to say what? Well done. You did what was necessary to land the client. What you see here is delivering such a story, making it experienceable and working on the level of values here, makes it clear that it's not a you need to do it without thinking rule set that we establish. We establish more a set of this is the culture and you get a context why it makes sense. Why wouldn't the entrepreneur fly first class? He wouldn't see the price appropriate given what it brings you. The moment you present him a scenario where booking that flight is actually the reasonable thing to do because you land a big client that you wouldn't have landed in another way, or it would have taken longer at least. Right now, the return on investment became clear and he was not only willing to tolerate it, he was willing to actually actively support it. Now here you see what quality it can have if you're getting the building blocks, the elements of successful culture building and successful leadership, even in remote times, right.